good seeing you all. There is a lot of material, and I want you to have an opportunity to ask questions, because that may be always the best part of the presentation. But I do want to give basic information. We have a new government for the first time in 12 years, not headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu. So there is some background about the new government I'd like to share with you, discuss the issues of the past 12 years, the issues the new government's going to face, where they might be different and where they might be the same. At the outset, I just want to, before we get into divisive matters, I always am very proud of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. It's a declaration that, in effect, Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, governed by the highest ethical principles and welcoming with equality, social equality, legal equality, economic equality to all its citizens, with a special call to the minority Arabs to participate in the development of the country. And like our own Declaration of Independence, sometimes the goal is missed. But if the pendulum keeps swinging forward, it has an occasional backward motion, then the day will come when the full equality and goals of the State of Israel will be realized. As a bit of a background, Joel, can you put up the slide that I sent you? All right, this shows the government of 61 seats, and it's made up, and if you will look, it's made up of parties from the right, center, left, and one of the Arab Israeli parties. These parties have very divergent platforms and goals. One could say this is wonderful. Now the Declaration of Independence establishing equality for all, it's reflected in this makeup of the government. But that isn't the case. The common denominator, which enabled the government to get a one-seat majority, was animosity and dislike on a personal level of Prime Minister Netanyahu by three of his former colleagues and members of his government, which is shown on the slide. Could you, okay, shown on the slide. If you see Yamina had elected 7 members to the Knesset. It is a far-right party. Naftali Bennett has been selected as the prime minister, and he is on record as there never being a Palestinian state next to Israel, self-rule, home rule, no domination by Israel, but not a separate state. And the reason for his opposition and that of Yisrael Beitenu, which is a Russian secular right party, again, no Palestinian state, and New Hope, which is led by Gideon Sa'ar. All three of those, that's 20 seats of the 61, are made up by parties from the right who have no interest in a Palestinian state. They have interest in improving living conditions, improving economic conditions, but not the creation of a state. And then if you go down to labor and merits, they are the supporters of strong supporters of a Palestinian state. And Yesh Yatid in blue and white. Yesh Yatid is led by Yair Lapid. He will be the rotating prime minister. They have the most seats in the current government. But in order to get the right-wing parties to join the coalition, they had to agree to a right-wing prime minister. So, and then we also have in the group Ram, which is an Arab conservative party, basically in the south of Israel, religiously conservative. And the Arab parties have never before been part of a government, never been asked to be a part of a government, and never were willing to join the part of the government. But Ram, led by Abbas, said, my people should share the values of being in a government, and we want to be a part of the system. And so that's an uplifting thought. But what binds them together is that the right-wing parties all had a falling out with Netanyahu. They all acknowledge, as everyone does, his great accomplishments on the economy, establishing relations with many states around the world, the Abraham Accords. Everyone acknowledges his accomplishments, but he became a one-man government. Anyone who disagreed with him was not only disagreed with, but was put in out of the game. He was a divisive personality, and he's under indictment for 3 felonies. And they felt he was not the type of leader Israel should have, and they had their personal grievances with him. So they joined in with the center and the left. They have a 1-seat majority because on the opposition, as you see, 58, Likud, which is still led by Netanyahu, he has absolute control of the opposition. No one is rising up against him. And the last one who tried that was Gideon Sa'ar from New Hope, and he was beaten very badly in a primary. And you have Shas, United Torah Jewish. Those are 2 Haredi parties of the far right, extreme Orthodox. You have the religious Zionist party, which is also extreme right, which does not recognize the rights of any of the Palestinians. And then you have the joint list, which is made up of 3 Arab parties, mostly on the left, and they are sitting in the opposition. They would not join with Ram for the government. So we have a government that's not of common interest, except they want to be a government of decency and to be a government which ends the negativity of as they perceive it, of the prior administration. Of the last 12 years, a divisive personality. And so each party has a coalition agreement, and the coalition agreements provide what's on the agenda. The reality, I wouldn't go through each agreement, but the reality is the only items that will come before the Knesset that will be passed are items upon which they have agreed to. Items which are contentious and divisive, they will not deal with. So we have a government which will try to restore decency, to recognize the right to be different, but not to demonize someone because they're different. So you can see with only a 1-vote majority and with so many parties involved with different interests, there won't be many subjects they can deal with. So let's go through the areas. Let's go through the areas where there is division within the government. some years ago, uh, Reuven Rivlin, shortly after he was elected as the president of Israel, made a speech in which he said, Israel is not adhering to the values of its Declaration of Independence. It is breaking into 4 separate tribes. He described them as the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi, the Arab, the religious Zionists, and the secular Jews. He said each one of these parties is promoting only issues upon which they have a benefit. They're not taking into consideration the overall good of the country. I read somewhere this comparison. When we have an orchestra with horn players, violin players, drum section, and so forth, each of them maintain their independence. Each of them play their own instrument, but not discordantly. They join together to provide for a overall musical piece. And so the analogy is that while these parties have differences, the desire is that these differences be reconciled for the good of the country. And right now, we're not there. And let's take the issues. You have the issue of the religious Haredi parties. They have 15 seats in the current Knesset, and prior governments, they had about the same amount of seats. Their votes were essentially necessary to get anything passed. And so we have the religious divide where the Haredis get a disproportionate amount of the budgetary income. They're exempt from serving in the military while students until the age of 35. The rabbinate controls marriage. The rabbinate controls divorce. The Orthodox rabbinate controls conversion. It controls kashrut, and it controls Shabbat and public transportation and commercial opening. And something like 60 or 70% of the Israelis object to that control, but the votes of the ultra right, they represent maybe 12 to 15% of the population. So they get 10%, 12% of the seats in the Knesset, and it just is not able within the Knesset, despite the overwhelming support from the public, to modify their control. And now that the government has proposed a couple of very modest changes on religion to open up the kashrut for other providers, still under rabbinical kosher supervision. And the Haredi are violently, and I say violently, opposing it. Violently, not physically, but verbally. They propose to add more people to the community-wide religious councils. They add more people, and that is, while still will be under the control of the rabbinate, the Orthodox rabbinate, that too. In fact, the name calling has become very severe. The Haredi newspapers refer to the government as anti-Jewish, as hostile to Judaism. When they have pictures of the members of Knesset, they block out the women. And so it's a very divided situation. And also, from an American point of view, Americans are greatly interested in the egalitarian portion of the wall. For years, there's been a provision to do that. It's never been implemented. And so there's a renewed effort to implement that law. So if there are some changes in the religious domination, they'll be on the margins. And you might ask, why is that if they're no longer in the government? Well, the right-wing members of the government hope, or at least some of them hope, that they'll be able to induce the religious parties to leave the opposition and join them. And so they don't want to antagonize them by going too far in religious modifications. And so this is a major problem. It's a subject of a whole discourse, the rules, particularly the Russians can't get married because many of them cannot establish that they're halakhically Jewish, and so they can't get married unless they go out of the country. It's a major problem. Same with divorce and all the other provisions that I mentioned. And it touches upon the nature of Israel. Israel is both a Jewish state of the Jewish people and a democratic state. Democratic means more than the right to vote. It means equality at all levels. And so this is a problem that will still continue to exist. Another source of tension for ever since the state is created is the Arab citizens of Israel. There are 2 million out of the 9 million population. 20% are minorities: Arabs, Arab Muslims, Christians, and Jews, mostly Arab Muslims. And again, budgetary, the Orthodox get an excessive allocation, and the Arabs get an under allocation for all services: social services, development services, criminal protection services, education services. And so here I think there is a potential good news. The coalition agreements that all have agreed to is going to provide more funds to the Arab communities for social services, more funds for schools, and more funds to help with a crime problem that exists within the Arab villages, and also to recognize some of the Arab villages in the Negev as lawful villages, and which will entitle them to more economic funds. So Mansour, the conservative leader of Ram, is able to obtain for his people more equitable distribution of funds and services, and for this reason, he is providing a service to his people. At the same time, he is being quiet on issues that would upset the apple cart. Of course, he wants a two-state solution, but he's not doing anything aggressively to pursue it. So I think on the Arab front, there's still much tension, particularly after Gaza, within the communities where Jews and Arabs together live. But I think with Abbas's and the Ram party, that these tensions will come under control. It was caused by radical elements both within the Jewish Israelis and the Arab Israelis. So I think there's some progress with regard to making the Arab citizens feel like they're a greater part of the Israel culture. And over the years, they have been doing much better in higher education. They have almost a number in the health services equal to doctors, nurses, pharmacists, equal to their percentage of population. So I think they're moving in the right direction, but still a long way long way to go. Now, in terms of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, the Prime Minister and the 20 members of the government would normally join in with the right-wing opponents in aggressively pursuing settlements, increasing the size of settlements and developing new settlements. If you remember, before the Trump plan was introduced a year or two ago, Israel was going to annex 60% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley. The Trump agreement brought a halt to that, and it's pretty clear that to maintain this government, Prime Minister Bennett and all members of the coalition have agreed they're not going to do anything to upset the status quo. They may improve the conditions of physical living conditions of the West Bank citizens, but there won't be any geopolitical changes in the status quo. And that's also something that President Biden has made clear to the government, that he wants the status quo so that at some time in the future, when there are new leaders, sometime in the future, when circumstances change, there's a possibility of a two-state solution. In our lifetime, regardless of which government, our lifetime and the lifetime of our children, I think the consensus is, not my thinking, the consensus is, there is no possibility of a two-state solution. If you recall, Dennis Ross at our temple made that clear at his lecture, and he made it clear in his books, and he made it clear, I interviewed him, made it clear, and he was intimately involved, that the parties are too far apart. He said, my favorite quote is, we can bridge a river, but we can't bridge an ocean. The difference is that great. And the Israeli public largely doesn't want to disturb the status quo. Last year, there was practically no attacks within Israel coming from the West Bank. Things are quiet, and that's because the Palestinian Authority and Israel, despite personal dislike between Abbas and Netanyahu, they have a common enemy, Hamas. And so they jointly support each other on security. And those of you who watch Fauda saw how much the Israelis support the Palestinian Authority. What happens when Abbas, who's now 85 and not in good health, when he goes? There's a concern of what will happen in the West Bank. Will there be a violent upset? Will there be a successor? Will Hamas take control, and all that means to Israel? So the foreign policy, the policy with the West Bank, the policy with Gaza, if anything, is stronger on the current administration. Netanyahu had a way of waiting until things got built up before he retaliated. Now Bennett has made it clear that anytime anything comes out of Gaza, incendiary balloon, any terror shot, there'll be immediate retaliation, which there has been. With regard to Syria and Iraq, the Israel Air Force still attacks facilities in Syria that are bringing in weapons from Iran. And so that policy will remain pretty much the same. Iran, Israel, Bennett and the government made clear to Iran, made clear to Biden administration that they do not want the United States to return to the prior agreement and release sanctions. They view the danger from a strong Iranian economy in support of their armies, Hezbollah and in Lebanon, is a far greater danger. The difference is Netanyahu, those who object to him, made his position clear publicly. And when he went to Congress and made his speech at the invitation of the Republicans, resulted in a deteriorated relations between the administration and with the Democratic Party. So one of the goals of Bennett and his administration is to try to heal those relationships. The major problem that's going to confront the government, because I think the notice of the meeting, which was over flattering of me, the notice of the meeting said, how long is this government going to last? Ben Franklin, if you remember, during a pre-revolutionary war, when it came to voting for a declaration of war, Ben Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. That's the condition of the coalition now. If they don't stick together, if one of them decides that they have to pursue their policy independently or votes against its own government and terminates the government, requiring another election, then they're going to all hang separately. So they got to hang together. The key time will be the latter part of November. Under Israeli law, a budget has to be adopted within 100 days, unless extended by the Knesset. That's what brought down the last government. Netanyahu thought it was to his benefit. Turns out he was wrong. Not to agree to a budget and go to another election. But if they don't agree to a budget in the end of November, then there must be an election under Israeli law. No budget, no government. The difference this time is that Bennett will be the head of the caretaker government until the election. But if they realize that their choice is another election in November as a result of not agreeing to a budget, that puts pressure on all of them to hang together, so they don't hang separately in a new election. So if there is a budget adopted, taking into account, look who they have to accommodate. They have to accommodate 8 parties. In the United States, it's hard enough to accommodate 2 parties, and we close up the government. Here, the budget's going to have to accommodate the wishes of 8 governments, 8 parties. That's going to be a real undertaking. But I think the pressure will be, I hope the pressure will be sufficient enough that they will hang together. And they'll hang together until such time as somebody thinks we can do better in the next election. And then the government will be broken up and there'll be another election. The danger is Netanyahu, not like our president who becomes the next president. He's now the head of the opposition. He's doing, and he has the parties under absolute control. He has his parties vote against. There was a bill a few weeks ago, a routine bill to extend the law dealing with what happens to in Israeli Arabs, what happens to a West Bank Arab who marries an Israeli Arab, and the law, from a security point of view, that person doesn't automatically become a resident of Israel. It has to go through a very difficult process to become a resident, security check, so forth. But that was a law that was adopted, that Netanyahu had readopted every 6 months. This time he voted against it just to show up to the government that they couldn't pass that law, which is what happened. They didn't pass. They didn't pass it. It was not a vote of confidence bill, so the government continued in control. So it's going to be very difficult to get through legislation that creates change, so long as so long as any of the members of the government don't agree. The key guy pushing the religious changes is the Minister of Finance, because the party he has, Liebenthal, is a Russian-speaking party, and he campaigned on the fact, yes, we are a Jewish state, but we're not a halachic state. And he opposes all the controls of the rabbinate, consistent with the large majority of Israelis. But now in control of the budget, he has some power to influence the allocation of monies. And going back to that for a moment, because I meant something very important, the Haredi community is growing because they have many more children, and so the budget allocation of them is increasing every year on a per capita basis, and they've consumed so much of the budget that schools are lacking money they need, hospitals are lacking money, infrastructure is lacking money. So, and in addition, their schools do not have a core curriculum, so they aren't learning science, aren't learning high tech. They're not learning language, and so they're not suitable. They can't get jobs in the workplace. And so the thought is, by cutting back a bit on their social welfare payments and payments for staying as students, instead they'll go out and train them, get training, go to a technical school, and go to university. And as a matter of fact, right now, the number of Haredi students in university, I just heard a figure yesterday, has increased from 1,000 to 14,000, in recognition that they need to make themselves employable, but it's still a tiny portion of the money. So that's where we are on the existing government. Bennett has tried to improve relationship with Jordan. The king of Jordan and Netanyahu had a falling out. The king refused to talk to Netanyahu. And now Gantz has already talked to him because they too provide joint security with Israel against terrorism coming across the river. And the king, in his recent testimony in Congress, said he likes this new Israel government, no condemnation of the new government. So a little improvement there. Relations with the Abrahamic countries is good. The relationship with France may be improving. Macron and the Israel government seem to making some headway. It's a more reasonable government. He feels that he may make some economic deals with and want to deal with them. The one worry is Putin. Netanyahu had very good relationships with Putin. Netanyahu talked to Putin more than any other leader of any other country. And they have an agreement in Syria. Russia is actively involved in Syria to bolster the government. Israel is opposed to goods coming in from Iran into Syria, missiles and so forth. And so they attack them. And so they have an understanding with Russia that they will each notify the other when they're in the other's zone to avoid confrontation. There's some question has been reported that Putin says enough. After the last Israel attack a couple of days ago, that's just a report in the paper. I have no way, and I haven't seen anyone corroborate it. But so that's another relationship that has to be maintained. The relationship with Poland is somewhat deteriorated because of Holocaust laws, restitution of property laws that are being amended in Poland. So I think in terms of just an overall summary, so you can get to the questions, I've left out, a lot of details, but I think I've given you a fairly good overview. And much to my amazement, I think it's the first time I've ever fulfilled the obligation to finish in a half hour. Maybe
Excellent.
So anyway, I think the questions, I hope they come because you'll pick up things I haven't talked about or ask about things I have talked about.
Harold, thank you on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much for another incredible and informative update. Israel is certainly never boring. I'm going to kick off the questions, if I may. To me, it seems as if Benjamin Netanyahu, even though he's officially out of power, is always lurking right beneath the surface, probably pulling a lot of strings. And I was just wondering, what is the status of the criminal cases against him? Because I would assume that would knock him right out. But what's the status there?
Status as follows. They've had one witness at direct exam. The prosecution has put on one witness for direct examination. It took several weeks. There were thousands and thousands of documents, emails, and so forth that the defendant got additional time to review these thousands of documents. The trial has now been postponed, I think, until September. But it's imposed for 3 months. That trial is going to take a very long time. The appeals are going to take a very long time. And I'm talking about years. And Netanyahu is going to be there. And he is controlling his 59 supporters. He is, in fact, in a sense, undermining the current government by dealing directly or trying to deal directly with the suppliers of vaccine in the United States, trying to then show to the public, look what I got for you, I've got enough. And he's pushing for a booster shot. So he is doing what he can. He's a master politician as well as an extraordinarily brilliant individual. It's the moral character which those who don't like him that's been attacked. And it's in the last number of years, the policies of the government have been only promoted if they also advance his interests. And he's going to continue doing that. The only thought, and I have not heard anyone suggest it, one of the few powers of the president of Israel is to pardon. Herzog, the current president, was a member of the Labor Party. So if he exercised the right of pardon with an agreement with Netanyahu that he will never again serve in any government position, Netanyahu may be sufficiently motivated to accept it. But short of that, no one that I've read, no one I've talked to, and that's a lot of people, has indicated that Netanyahu is going to go anywhere. He delights in making life difficult for the majority government, and he's succeeding. But the government is much more, as I say, it recognizes, and the arguments are spirited, but it recognizes you can't demonize someone, you can't destroy your own tools of government. And they're filling in blanks in the State Department that existed because Netanyahu controlled everything. So I think it's doing a good civil job of trying to run a government. But that's a long answer to your question. He's going to be around for a long time.
It's okay. It's a thorough answer, and I appreciate it. So anyone else, if you please raise your hand. Okay, Murray Simon, go ahead.
Thank you. Harold, as usual, very informative. I always learn something with you every single time.
Thank you.
Being in Los Angeles, I saw in the news today that the teachers union, which Los Angeles has the second largest school education system in the country, 600,000 students. The teachers union here in May adopted a platform to support BDS and support the Palestinian state. But it was never, well, they didn't adopt it, they proposed it. But apparently ADL has been exerting a lot of pressure and other Jewish organizations. So it looks like that plank, whatever, is going to be tabled for the moment. So the question I have is this: pressure on Israel from outside the country, in other words, the United States, even from the Jewish community. Does that have any effect on some of these policies?
I think it's clear that Biden is extremely supportive of the state of Israel. He has his red line is, don't do anything that's going to upset the future possibility. And talk to us privately. We will talk to you privately. We will keep you informed when we disagree, because countries can disagree, but let's do it in a way not to embarrass either side or to hurt either side. So I think, I don't think you'll see pressure. The pressure from our government will be, don't set up new settlements. Don't do anything drastic. And as evidence of that, Biden campaigned on wanting to establish reopen the consulate for Palestinians in Jerusalem. And this is a problem. Biden wants to do it, but this is a problem to the government, because the right-wing members of the government, the New Hope and Bennett and Israel Beitenu, they're right-wing. They don't want to see an Israeli consulate in Jerusalem, because that gives some sort of hint that there's still a claim to the undivided Jerusalem that someone is recognizing. Well, Biden wanted to go ahead with it, but he learned that would create difficulty for the government, serious difficulty. So Biden has agreed not at this time to pursue opening up a Palestinian consulate. I think, and Israel has been very good in resisting pressure from governments. If Macron comes across, that'll reduce some of the negativity. I think I've expressed, I normally don't express my point of view, but I'll express it now. I think the recent poll, which showed that 25% of American Jews feel that Israel is an apartheid state, is a much more serious problem. And among the younger people, the percentage is much higher. And what is there? I just put a question back to everybody. What can we do? Most of our contemporaries of our age brackets, or a bit younger, don't know the history of Israel. They don't know the threat that terrorism poses to Israel. They don't know that in 2000 Arafat was offered 97% of the West Bank, plus a division of Jerusalem. And he couldn't get himself to accept it. Instead, he started the second Intifada in 2000. It lasted 5 years until 2005, in which 4,000 or 5,000 Israelis were killed by suicide bombers. I was there during that period, sometimes during that period. People were afraid to go to the restaurants. People were afraid to go to any public places. Children had to carry phones to keep in touch with their parents, because terrorist bombing was something that they couldn't predict. And so that was the effort of that's what turned the Israeli public. Until then, you would have seen the Israeli public said, make peace, we'll support it. So, but now Israeli public is afraid of any agreement without absolute control over security, and that's not going to happen. It's not a state. The Palestinians don't have a state if Israel controls security inside their own government, and so. But how do we educate? Our children don't know any of the history. They don't know. We apply. We look at them and say, "Oh, the poor Palestinians, the poor Gazans." Well, look what Gaza, the 4,000 missiles. There's no recognition of what it is to live in Israel, surrounded in this tiny country by Hezbollah and Lebanon. Syria, which is now a basket case, so is Lebanon, but Hezbollah is still there. And if Hamas comes into the West Bank, it's a very tough situation. So how do we educate people on that? So that I think is the greater danger, and that's why you see these BDS students, Yale, California, all over the country, adopt proposals that their university disinvest in any Israel activity or corporation. I think the greater danger is with our own American diaspora.
I'm inclined to agree with you, and sadly, it's so much easier now to spread misinformation and disinformation than it ever was. I mean, just look at what I've read recently is that I think 25 to 30% of Americans no longer accept that the Holocaust was a genuine occurrence. That's just hard to believe. We have a question from Ted Probst in the chat. The four Congress members who are colloquially known as the Squad, the Liberal Democrats, will they push Biden to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv and to be more supportive of the Palestinians over Israel? I just wonder how much influence they actually have.
I think it's zero in terms of getting the embassy moved back to. That isn't going to happen while Biden is president. And what was the second part of the question?
Well, that was basically it, to be more supportive of the Palestinians.
That won't happen.
As far as I know, they wield virtually no power at this point. Eric.
Harold, once again, thanks for a very comprehensive presentation. We always learn a lot. You're our go-to person for updates. My question for you is, what are your major sources of information for all the material for your presentations? Are you reading Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, etc. every day, as well as other sources? Can you tell us how you glean all the information that you impart to us?
So first, because I do a lot of history and so forth, first it came from my parents who were ardent Zionists, and I grew up as a teenager listening to them on the telephone with their friends and so forth. And so my mother was a member of Hadassah in 1924, for the first Hadassah chapter in Toronto. I mean, these are the kind of stories. Her first Hadassah chapter in Canada was in Toronto, where my mother lived. So we were ardent, and had an aunt who was a vice president of National Hadassah. It was just a Zionist family in terms of background. And then so it's always been there. I've always read, and I've always kept up to date. But then 2 years ago, with four other attorneys, I went on a 1 week trip to Israel, where we met with three retired Supreme Court, recently retired Supreme Court judges, met with law school deans, met with professors, met with a lawyer from Herzog's law firm, met with the leading political writer for Yediot, met with Gideon Sa'ar, who's now the head of New Hope, met with other politicians, met with Uri Regev, the head of the Reform Worldwide Reform Movement at one time, and now Hiddush on religious matters. We met with every think tank, including with one that Stuart Eisenstadt, who was present, is a part of. We met with liberals. We met with right wing. We met with Professor Kantorowicz, who I know you read the Wall Street Journal. And if you saw a few days ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal by Kantorowicz. He's a professor in U.S. and in Israel, who is a very right wing, who makes the case as a lawyer, legal grounds, that legal title to the entire West Bank is still in Israel. I can go through the legal with you, but it'll take too long. But so we met with everyone. Since then, we've been doing Zoom sessions with them. And so we keep current. And then finally, we have family, cousins, who in the last 20 years that we have met, including Begin's press advisor during the negotiations with Egypt. And so I stay in touch with a lot of these people. I sent a note during the time of the falling of the missiles in Israel and on Jerusalem. I was in touch with the Arab Supreme Court judge that I met with, Salam Jubran. And so I stay in touch. I'm in touch with another Supreme Court judge by email regularly. And so I have, and then some Buffalo folks who have made Aliyah, who are very engaged politically, following the scene. So I have so many sources, and then I read all the Israeli papers except those that don't have an English edition, and I read those twice a day in case there's some updated news. I guess that exhausts my and then of course I talk here to people who know about Israel too, and I say, Harold, did you know such and such? And so I think I have multiple sources, and planning, God willing, and COVID permitting, my health permitting, to do a reprise of the trip to Israel this November with another 6 or 7 colleagues. We have access through our connection with the International Jewish Lawyers in Israel to make these arrangements. And they're just incredible. We just 5, imagine sitting around, it's like like sitting around in someone's kitchen, schmoozing about the problem. So it's a very informal, informative relationship.
Thank you, Harold. We have a question from Isaac Calvaria. Go ahead, Isaac.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. The Biden administration seems to be trying to walk a fine line between supporting Palestinians and supporting Israel. Is there a chance that the Biden administration is going to reduce financial support to Israel, including support for replenishing the Iron Dome systems?
No, there's a binding agreement on that.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. If you don't mind, Harold, if you don't mind me chiming in on that agreement, which was increased several years ago, has become very much a bi-directional thing in that it always provided support for Israel to develop it and produce weapons for their own defense, and then became something that helped them develop the ability to export weapons. But what has happened more recently is that you mentioned the Iron Dome. More recently, the United States military has started to incorporate some of these weapons in the U.S. military that were jointly developed by Israel and the United States, like the Iron Dome, like the Spike anti-tank missile, like the Trophy active defense system that's being now installed on American tanks, and also being installed on 250 tanks that we just agreed to sell to Poland. So it's a bi-directional thing. I
Yes,
think
it
we
is.
have time for one more question. Anyone? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Going once? Going twice? Well, I think we've come to the end. Harold, once again, I want to thank you for an amazing presentation. Eric, did you want to say anything before we close?
Harold, on behalf of all of us, on behalf of the entire TBS congregation, I'd like to thank you once again for a really excellent presentation. As we all know, Israeli politics keep us guessing from day to day, and so we rely on you through your multiple sources to keep us updated. As you all know, Harold writes for the Herald Tribune, he writes for the Jewish News, has articles for the Messenger, etc. So we really are very appreciative of all you do to keep us updated, Harold. Thank you once again.
I want you to know it's more of a pleasure for me to do it. I enjoy it. Once I start, I enjoy it. The preparation I don't enjoy, but once I do it, I enjoy it.
Excellent. Al, do you have any closing remarks before we go?
No, it is always, Harold, you've done it again. And I think you did a great job basically simplifying the composition of the Israeli government and touching most, if not all, of the major issues. So we thank you very much, and I have a feeling we'll have you back at least 12 more times.
Well, that's the great honors to be invited back. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Harold. Thank you, Al, Eric, and everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found it as informative as I did. And tune in again for our next program.